Today is May 2026. And the global economy is, well, it's currently being held hostage.
Yeah, completely held hostage.
Right. And if you've been watching the news or, scrolling through your feeds, listening to all the political speeches about this so-called fragile ceasefire in the U.S.-Iran standoff, you are essentially watching a magic trick.
Oh, absolutely. It's classic misdirection. I mean, the missiles, the fiery press conferences, the endless debates over who shot first, that is the magician's right hand.
Exactly. It's the grand, flashy, dramatic gesture. You've got sparks, you've got smoke, and as an audience member, your eyes are just totally glued to the spectacle. You literally can't look away.
Right, because human nature dictates we look at the explosion.
But the entire time you were staring at those fireworks of the right hand, the magician's left hand is quietly, efficiently, and just invisibly picking your pocket.
Yeah.
You walk out of the theater arguing with the guy next to you about how the trick was done, completely unaware that your wallet is gone until you get to your car. So, welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here for this one.
Because today, we are going to look very closely at the left hand. The mission of this deep dive, based on a massive stack of intelligence reports, verified satellite imagery, economic models, is basically to drop a massive truth bomb. Because you are being fed a highly polished, very deliberate false binary right now.
It's a narrative cage. We're all being told to, pick a team jersey. It's either a red hat or a green flag.
Right, exactly.
You're told this is a story of imperialist American aggression versus heroic sovereign Iranian resistance. Or, you flip the channel and it's suddenly the story of a flawless, decisive U.S. military victory versus unprovoked Iranian piracy.
But those two highly divisive scenarios, they are the diversion. They are the flashy right hand. They're literally designed to force you into a tribal camp, to get you arguing with your neighbor about who the quote-unquote good guy is.
And while you're doing that, the devastating consequences are sneaking right by.
Yeah. We are overfed these two garbage narratives because they offer, emotionally satisfying, absolute outcomes for one political base or the other. It sparks these misinformed, polarized opinions, and that division is the whole point.
It's a diversion.
Exactly. It keeps everyone from asking why the hell we are in this situation in the first place. We never get the actual whys of these events. We're just given these two shit scenarios that cause division because neither of them actually offers a good outcome.
Yeah. When the truth is, there are usually more than two ways to skin a cat. But when we get trapped in these debates over moral high grounds, we just stop looking at the mechanics of the situation.
You stop looking at the leverage.
Yeah, the leverage, the geography, and most importantly, who is actually paying the price for these political decisions.
Which is why, as we dig into this material today, and we're looking at statements from Donald Trump, from the highest levels of the Iranian government, military brass on all sides, our job here is not to pick a winner.
No, not at all.
We are not endorsing anyone's politics. We aren't justifying anyone's violence. And we definitely aren't assigning moral scorecards. Our only mission today is to strip away all those heroic adjectives and just look at the cold, hard math of what is physically happening on the ground and in the global markets.
We have to look at the raw mechanics of power. That's the only way to really understand a crisis of this magnitude. You have to look at the undeniable physical and economic receipts, regardless of, which political leader ends up looking incompetent in the process.
Right, so let's pull the timeline apart and look at those exact receipts, because the official narrative from Washington over the last few weeks is that Operation Epic Fury, which was the military campaign launched on February 28th, was this surgical crushing success.
The main talking point is that the military phase is essentially over.
Yeah, essentially over. But when you look at the timeline of how this violence actually unfolded, it absolutely shatters the illusion of a clean, controlled operation. So let's wind the clock back to that late February flashpoint.
Okay, so February 28th, 2026. This is when U.S. and Israeli forces initiate Operation Epic Fury. And the kinetic reality of this opening salvo was massive.
Massive.
We are talking about waves of heavy, precision military strikes targeting Iranian ballistic missile capabilities, their sprawling drone production facilities, naval assets.
Basically everything.
Yeah, and the deep command and control infrastructure supporting all of it. The stated goal from the U.S. was to decisively degrade Iran's ability to project power and threaten the region. The architects of this strike basically believed they could deliver a crippling knockout blow to Iran's asymmetric capabilities in just a matter of days.
But the intelligence assessments and the post-action reports, They show that Iran did not collapse. They didn't wave a white flag, and they certainly didn't lose their ability to project power.
No, they didn't.
Instead, they absorbed that massive conventional blow and then responded with these highly coordinated missile and drone salvos. And they didn't just hit back locally at ships or something. They struck U.S. military sites across the entire Persian Gulf region.
Just incredibly widespread.
I'm looking at the target list here in our sources. It's bases in Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan. They hit Israeli targets, Gulf targets. I mean, it was a full regional saturation attack.
And to understand how they pulled that off while their own factories were literally burning, we really have to look at the mechanics of asymmetric warfare. Because in a conventional head-to-head military matchup, Iran cannot defeat the United States.
Right. The disparity in sheer firepower is astronomical.
Exactly. I mean, fifth-generation fighter jets, the U.S. defense budget, it's not even close. But asymmetric warfare isn't about matching your opponent tank for tank. It's about using unconventional, cheaper weapons to basically bypass your opponent's armor entirely and impose an unacceptable cost.
I want to really dig into that mechanism because people hear about quote-unquote drone swarms and they picture something from like a sci-fi movie. But practically speaking, how does a country that just had its military infrastructure pounded by stealth bombers manage to penetrate billions of dollars worth of U.S. air defenses at these regional bases?
It comes down to math and radar processing limits.
Okay, break that down.
So the U.S. forward operating bases in places like, say, Qatar or Bahrain, they're protected by incredibly sophisticated systems, right? Like the Patriot missile batteries. Now, a single Patriot interceptor missile costs roughly $4 million.
$4 million for one missile.
For one missile. And it is designed to shoot down high-altitude, high-speed ballistic missiles or advanced enemy fighter jets. But what Iran has spent the last 2 decades perfecting is the cheap, low-flying, loitering munition.
Like the Shahed drones.
Exactly, the Shaheds. These are essentially flying lawnmowers packed with explosives that cost maybe $20,000 to produce.
So you have a $20,000 piece of plastic and fiberglass flying against a $4 million interceptor.
Right. And that economic asymmetry is just the start of the problem. The tactical asymmetry is that Iran doesn't just launch one drone, they launch dozens or even hundreds simultaneously, and they mix them with cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. Right. And they program these drones to fly incredibly low to the ground. They use the natural terrain to mask their approach from the early warning radars. So by the time the Patriot battery or the base defense systems actually track them, the system is completely overwhelmed.
The computers can only process so much data at once.
Exactly. The computers can only track and prioritize so many targets. And the base only has so many interceptor missiles in its tubes before it physically needs to reload. So if you fire 50 cheap drones at a base with 30 interceptors, 20 drones are getting through. It's just math.
Wow. Which completely explains how they were able to reach out and touch American assets across 6 different sovereign nations. Because the U.S. has to project power globally, which means relying on these sprawling fixed bases in allied countries.
And those bases are essentially massive smoothernary targets.
Right. Iran's salvos prove that while the U.S. can bomb their factories, Iran can just bypass the multi-billion-dollar shield and set American barracks on fire.
And that physical vulnerability is exactly what triggered the pivot to the economic phase. Because on March 4, 2026, realizing they had proved their point militarily but couldn't really sustain a long-term shootout in the sky, Iran shifted the center of gravity.
They moved the battlefield.
They moved it to the one place on the map where geography gave them absolute supremacy. They restricted the Strait of Hormuz.
The Strait restriction. And the U.S. responds to this by initiating a full naval blockade on Iranian ports and their oil exports. They deploy warships to basically cut off Iran's economic jugular.
Right.
So by mid-March, you have missiles flying, military bases burning across the Middle East, the world's most important shipping lane locked down, and an active naval blockade. And then we jump to early April, around April 7th or 8th, and we are told by politicians that a fragile ceasefire has been mediated by Pakistan.
Yeah, the Pakistan mediation was real in the sense that officials actually met in Islamabad to pass messages. But adopting the word ceasefire to describe the reality of early April, that is narrative management at its absolute finest.
It's completely absurd when you look at the actual parameters of the situation on the ground. I mean, if there is still an active U.S. naval blockade with warships intercepting tankers—
Which there was.
Right. If there is still massive physical restrictions on international shipping, if there is a brand new, highly aggressive bureaucratic tolling authority being set up by Iran to literally tax ships,
Yeah, the daily testing of limits.
Exactly.
Mm.
Constant daily testing of the limits by fast attack boats. Calling this a ceasefire is just a pacifier for the financial markets.
Because the term ceasefire historically implies a cessation of hostilities, a mutual stand down, and a return to the pre-conflict status quo. But what the data shows here is not peace. It is simply a tactical pause in major kinetic explosions.
The core fight is still happening.
Oh, absolutely. The struggle over the Strait of Hormuz, the naval blockade, the economic strangulation, that is very much alive. The war simply transitioned from dropping bombs to holding the global supply chain hostage.
Let's bring this right up to the present day, May 2026. Because the institutionalization of this crisis is wild to me. The U.S. launches an initiative called Project Freedom.
Right.
On paper, this is framing American warships as a sort of armored Brinks truck for global shipping. They were attempting to physically wedge the strait open by having U.S. destroyers literally escort commercial tankers through the waters.
But the strategic flaw with that Brinks truck approach is just the sheer volume of traffic. You cannot physically escort every single supertanker and cargo ship through a 21-mile-wide choke point when the adversary has thousands of anti-ship missiles buried in the coastal mountains right next to you.
It's impossible.
It requires an unsustainable level of naval deployment, which is exactly why the U.S. paused Project Freedom very quickly, citing quote-unquote progress in diplomatic talks.
But the pause wasn't mutual. While the U.S. is stepping back its escorts, Iran makes a massive, highly calculated bureaucratic move. They announced the creation of the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, the PGSA.
And the PGSA is just a masterclass in asymmetric statecraft. They frame it not as a military blockade, but as a legitimate administrative body.
Oh, it's brilliant and terrifying.
They claim they're managing operations in the strait, providing real-time navigation updates, ensuring environmental safety, and here is the real kicker, charging a toll for passage.
It is an extortion racket dressed up in a suit and tie. I mean, they are offering to provide real-time updates to the ships. It's like the mafia offering you a very polite, mandatory subscription service for fire insurance while just tossing a Zippo lighter in their hands.
That's exactly what it is.
And meanwhile, you have leaders in Washington standing at podiums declaring that the military phase is over, that the U.S. objectives were met, and we are in a period of de-escalation.
Right, but by creating the PGSA, Iran is attempting a massive geopolitical heist. They are trying to take a temporary wartime disruption and cement it into a permanent legal and economic reality. If they can force the international shipping community, the Greek ship owners, the Chinese energy firms, the global insurance syndicates in London, if they can force them to recognize the PGSA, to log their transit with them, and eventually pay tolls to them for safe passage, Iran has fundamentally rewritten the rules of global maritime trade.
They literally take a global commons and turn it into a sovereign toll road.
Exactly.
Okay, so if the official narrative from the U.S. side is that Operation Epic Fury was a success, that we severely degraded their capabilities and the war is essentially over, we really need to look at the physical evidence on the ground. Because does the reality match the rhetoric?
Usually it doesn't.
Right, and the Washington Post investigation, which utilized highly detailed commercial satellite imagery, blew my mind. Because you can spin a press conference all day long, but you cannot spin a high-resolution photograph from space.
You really can't. The independent damage assessments tell a vastly different story than the victory laps we're seeing on TV. The Washington Post didn't just rely on U.S. defense leaks. They cross-verified imagery from commercial companies like Maxar and Planet Labs, and even cross-referenced it with Iranian state-affiliated brags.
They did a totally comprehensive visual count of the U.S. military sites in the region after that Iranian retaliation. And I want to give you, the listener, the exact numbers from this investigation because they are staggering. At least 228 structures or pieces of major equipment were damaged or destroyed.
228.
Yeah, 220. And this wasn't a lucky strike on one poorly defended outpost. This damage was spread across 15 or more U.S. military sites in the region.
We are looking at critical infrastructure that takes years to build. We're talking about massive aircraft hangars completely gutted by fire, barracks destroyed, sprawling fuel depots, which, by the way, are the absolute lifeblood of any air operation, severely damaged or entirely immolated.
Just gone.
Gone. Multi-million-dollar early warning radar systems, communications nodes, and the advanced air defense systems themselves were disabled.
And the financial cost is estimated into hundreds of millions of dollars in just the opening weeks. The reports literally describe multiple U.S. bases as being left, quote, all but uninhabitable.
Uninhabitable. Think about what that means for power projection.
Right. And the human cost, which is so often heavily massaged in the initial reporting, around 15 U.S. personnel killed and hundreds more wounded, many with traumatic brain injuries from the overpressure of the blasts.
It's devastating.
Now, to be completely fair and accurate to the data, our sources do show that Iran took severe, massive hits to its own military infrastructure, missile launchers, naval vessels, command bunkers. Their conventional capacity was seriously degraded.
The degradation on the Iranian side was profound, absolutely. They took a huge hit. But this goes back to the concept of the knockout blow fallacy in modern warfare.
Right, explain that.
Taking out conventional infrastructure, like destroying a drone factory or a massive missile silo, it does not eliminate a nation's ability to wage war if their entire doctrine is built around decentralization. Iran has spent decades burying their most critical assets deep inside mountains and distributing their mobile launchers across vast, rugged terrain.
The metaphor I keep coming back to when looking at this Washington Post data is a homeowner who spends $50,000 on a state-of-the-art, high-tech security system. Cameras, lasers, motion sensors, the works.
Right.
And then a burglar bypasses the entire system by simply smashing the living room window with a $5 crowbar and walking out with the television.
Yep.
The homeowner is standing in the front yard the next morning telling all the neighbors, "My security system worked flawlessly. The house is perfectly secure." But everyone can plainly see the shattered glass on the lawn. Why do leaders do this? Why do they downplay these massive infrastructural hits?
Because admitting the effectiveness of the $5 crowbar shatters the illusion of deterrence.
Oh, that makes sense.
In international relations, deterrence relies heavily on the perception of invulnerability. The entire U.S. security umbrella in the Middle East, and globally for that matter, is built on the premise that attacking an American base is a suicidal endeavor that will yield zero tactical advantage.
Right, it's supposed to be untouchable.
Exactly. So if a superpower admits that a middle-tier regional power successfully penetrated its air defenses, destroyed its radars, and rendered its forward operating bases uninhabitable, it signals to every other adversary on the globe, from Beijing to Moscow to Pyongyang, that American forward deployments are vulnerable.
Wow. So the political instinct is always to just minimize the damage, tightly control the flow of information, and declare sweeping success based entirely on the damage you inflicted on the enemy, while burying your own catastrophic losses in classified briefings.
It's an instinct that worked perfectly in the 20th century, but it is failing spectacularly in the modern information age. I mean, leaders are still trying to run Vietnam-era or Gulf War-era propaganda playbooks in a world where a civilian analyst sitting in London can buy commercial satellite time with a credit card.
Right, and just count the craters.
Exactly. They count the exact number of destroyed hangars in Qatar, and they publish the high-resolution images on the internet an hour later. You can't hide it anymore.
Okay, so the receipts show us that neither side achieved a clean knockout militarily. It was a brutal, incredibly costly exchange of blows that basically left both sides bleeding. And because Iran realized they couldn't win a conventional shootout in the sky over the long term, they shifted the center of gravity.
They moved the fight to geography.
They moved it to the Strait of Hormuz.
Hmm.
And this is where the geopolitics hits the pavement for the average person listening to this right now. I want to spend significant time on this because our sources are explicit here. This geographic fact is the massive economic gun pointed at the world, and politics simply cannot wish it away. It really can't.
So let's paint a physical picture for the listener. What exactly is the Strait of Hormuz, and why does a dispute over this specific patch of water terrify global markets?
Physically, it is an incredibly narrow passage of water connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and eventually to the open ocean. It is the only sea passage from the Persian Gulf to the open ocean.
The only one.
The only one. At its absolute narrowest point, the strait is only about 21 miles wide. But the shipping lanes themselves, like the deepwater channels that those massive supertankers actually require to avoid running aground, those are only 2 miles wide in each direction, separated by a 2-mile buffer zone.
2 miles wide. I mean, you can practically see across it on a clear day.
Easily. And through that 2-mile wide throat, on a normal day before this crisis, roughly 20% of the world's traded oil passes.
20%.
Yeah, we are talking about 20 to 21 million barrels of oil every single day. It also handles a massive portion of the world's liquefied natural gas, or LNG, primarily coming out of Qatar. Economically, it is the jugular vein of the global energy market. So how do you actually restrict it? Do you just park a big ship sideways like the Suez Canal?
You don't even need to physically block the water. You leverage the insurance markets.
Really? Insurance?
Yeah, insurance. Iran possesses a massive arsenal of anti-ship cruise missiles hidden in the Zagros Mountains overlooking the strait. They have fleets of those fast attack swarm boats armed with torpedoes and heavy machine guns. And critically, they have sea mines.
Oh, wow.
So all Iran has to do is declare the strait restricted, conduct a few aggressive boardings of commercial vessels, or drop a handful of naval mines into the water. The moment the threat becomes credible, the global maritime insurance syndicates like Lloyd's of London, they skyrocket their war risk premiums.
So the insurance becomes so expensive that the shipping companies literally cannot afford to move the oil.
Exactly. The risk of losing a $100 million supertanker and its $100 million cargo of crude oil becomes way too high. The ships just stop sailing. They drop anchor in the Gulf of Oman or the Arabian Sea, and they just wait.
And we saw the immediate, terrifying economic shock of that in early March. When Iran initiated its squeeze and the U.S. countered with its naval blockade, the global markets went into sheer panic. The economic data from our sources notes that Brent crude, which is the major international benchmark for oil prices, it surged dramatically. It spiked over $120 a barrel.
That's massive.
We're talking about 50% gains in an incredibly short period compared to pre-conflict levels. Cargoes were stranded out at sea. Exporters in Saudi Arabia and the UAE had to declare force majeure,
Right.
which is a legal clause that basically means act of God. We literally cannot fulfill our contractual obligations to deliver your oil because the shipping lane is an active war zone.
And I want to trace the mechanism of that price spike, because this is the invisible left hand picking the listener's pocket. The pain of this disruption isn't abstract. It doesn't just stay on a trading screen in New York or London.
Yes, let's walk through the energy tax, because the narrative managers are having us argue over the politics of Operation Epic Ferry. But the listener is physically paying for this brinkmanship at the grocery store.
Exactly.
So walk us through the supply chain. A barrel of oil gets stuck behind the Strait of Hormuz. What happens next?
Okay, so within hours of the strait being restricted, the global supply of available oil shrinks drastically. Refineries in Asia and Europe, which rely heavily on Middle Eastern crude, realize they're going to run short. So they bid up the price of oil from other sources, Texas, Norway, West Africa.
Everyone's fighting for the remaining oil.
Right. So the global price skyrockets to that $120 mark. Now, that expensive crude oil arrives at a refinery. The refinery turns it into gasoline, jet fuel, and diesel. But because their raw material costs just jumped 50%, the wholesale price of diesel skyrockets.
And diesel is the blood of the physical economy.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah.
Every single 18-wheeler hauling produce from a farm in California to a supermarket in Chicago runs on diesel. The trucking companies are operating on razor-thin margins, so the moment diesel spikes, they pass that cost directly to the distributor through massive fuel surcharges.
So the distributor passes it to the supermarket.
And the supermarket passes it to you. Suddenly, a gallon of milk, a carton of eggs, or a pound of beef is 15% more expensive than it was last month.
And it's not just the transportation of the food, it's the physical packaging too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Petroleum is the foundational ingredient for polymers and plastics. The plastic wrap on your meat, the clamshell container for your berries, the Amazon bubble mailer showing up on your porch. The manufacturing cost for all of that surges.
Wow.
And if you look at aviation, jet fuel is a massive percentage of an airline's operating cost. So passenger ticket prices jump, and the cost of overnight air freight just explodes.
And all of this feeds directly into massive sticky inflation. The economic models cited in our reports were projecting severe structural drags on global GDP if the strait stayed heavily restricted into the second quarter of the year.
It's a huge drag.
Large Asian economies like Japan, South Korea, and China, and heavily industrialized European nations like Germany, which are highly dependent on imported energy, they were facing immediate recessionary pressures.
This is the sheer brutal genius of Iran's asymmetric strategy. They realized they couldn't defeat the Pentagon, so they bypassed the U.S. military entirely and took the global economy hostage. They created a scenario where every single consumer on the planet feels the pain of their geographic leverage.
Which brings us back to the institutionalization of the crisis with the PGSA and Project Freedom, because you have the U.S. using its warships to try and force the strait open on its own terms, framing it as defending international commerce.
Yeah.
But at the exact same time, you have the U.S. Navy actively blockading Iranian oil exports, strangling their economy to force them to the negotiating table. And Iran is using its PGSA toll booth scheme to try and legitimize its control over the choke point.
It is literally two sides of the same coercive coin. Both nations are using military and bureaucratic power to control the exact same narrow strip of water, and both are playing an incredibly dangerous game of chicken with the global supply chain.
So if a diplomatic and military reality is this bleak, if the physical damage to U.S. bases was catastrophic, leaving facilities uninhabitable and soldiers dead, and if the economic shock is levying a crippling inflation tax on the entire world, we have to ask the ultimate question.
The big why.
This is the core of the truth bomb. Was this catastrophic violence actually necessary? Was the eruption on February 28th an inevitable, unavoidable tragedy of geopolitics?
The intelligence assessments and diplomatic histories in our stack of sources give a very definitive, very sobering answer. No, it was not inevitable at all.
The sources outline an alternative path that existed right up until the bomb started dropping. Let's pull back the curtain on the Oman diplomatic back channel, because the public narrative is that diplomacy had utterly failed, that Iran was racing toward a nuclear weapon, and there was simply no choice but to strike.
But that's not what was actually happening in the shatter.
Exactly.
What was happening?
What the public didn't see was a sustained, highly complex, and actually quite promising diplomatic track moving forward indirectly via the Sultanate of Oman. Oman has historically played the role of the neutral Switzerland of the Middle East. They are a trusted interlocutor for both Washington and Tehran.
I want to understand the physical mechanics of this. What does an indirect negotiation actually look like? Are they in the same room?
Usually they are in the same luxury hotel in Muscat, Oman, but on different floors or in different wings.
Okay.
The U.S. delegation sits in one suite, the Iranian delegation sits in another, and senior Omani diplomats literally walk back and forth down the hallways carrying proposals, clarifications, and non-papers between the two rooms. Wow, literally walking down the hall.
Yeah. It allows both sides to negotiate deeply technical issues without the political optics of sitting across a table and shaking hands with their sworn enemy.
And according to the reports, this hallway diplomacy was producing real, tangible progress prior to February 28th. Iran was actually in a severely weakened position at the time. Their domestic economy was buckling under the weight of existing sanctions, they were facing internal dissent, and they were desperate for a financial lifeline.
Very desperate.
Because of that vulnerability, they were signaling a willingness to make major structural concessions on their nuclear program.
The parameters being discussed were significant. Iran was signaling they would accept hard caps on their uranium enrichment levels, ensuring they stayed far below the 90% threshold required for weapons-grade material.
Which is huge.
It is. They were discussing physical reductions to their existing fissile material stockpiles, literally shipping it out of the country. And crucially, they were willing to allow a stronger, highly intrusive verification by the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency.
What does intrusive verification physically mean?
It means allowing international inspectors physical access to nuclear sites 247. It means installing tamper-proof, real-time cameras monitoring the centrifuges. It means swabbing facilities for undeclared nuclear particles and accounting for every single ounce of uranium gas pumped through the system.
Wow.
It is the architectural framework required to absolutely guarantee that a country is not sneaking toward a bomb.
And in exchange for opening their doors to the IAEA and capping their program, what was Iran asking for?
Sanctions relief. Specifically, unfreezing billions of dollars of their own money that was locked in foreign banks, like in South Korea or Iraq, due to U.S. financial sanctions.
So it was a trade.
It was a purely transactional arrangement. It wasn't about a grand reconciliation or becoming allies. It was a cold, calculated trade, verifiable limits on the nuclear threat in exchange for economic breathing room.
Our sources explicitly outline what should have happened based on this progress. They argue the U.S. should have doubled down on that Omani diplomacy. The administration should have used calibrated, reversible pressure.
Right. Like if Iran balks, you tighten specific banking sanctions or intercept a few proxy weapons shipments. But you keep the pressure non-kinetic. You prioritize the nuclear file above all else, coordinate with European allies to present a unified diplomatic front, and accept imperfect but highly verifiable limits.
This approach is grounded in a concept called diplomatic realism. It's the mature understanding that in international relations, especially in the Middle East, perfect, maximalist outcomes simply do not exist.
They just don't.
If you demand total capitulation from an adversary like demanding they scrap their entire missile program, abandon their regional proxies, and dismantle every centrifuge before you lift a single sanction, you usually guarantee conflict.
Because they'll never agree to that.
Right. Diplomatic realism dictates that you accept a flawed, ugly deal that verifiably boxes in the most severe existential threat, the nuclear program, because the alternative is a regional war, which is infinitely more unpredictable and costly. I hear that, but I have to play devil's advocate here for the listener. Because when you explain this to the public, the immediate pushback is obvious. It is very easy to preach diplomatic realism in hindsight, sitting in a studio far away from the Middle East.
Sure.
But when a superpower is dealing with a regime that actively funds proxy militias across the region, that attacks its neighbors, that constantly hedges its bets, and plays shell games with its nuclear breakout timelines, doesn't diplomacy just look like weakness? Doesn't endless talking in luxury hotels just give them the time and cover they need to secretly build the bomb?
You're touching on something critical there, because that is the exact argument that the architects of Operation Epic Fury used to justify the strikes. And it is a textbook illustration of a core political science concept called the security dilemma.
And the security dilemma.
Yeah. The security dilemma occurs when trust between two nations is at absolute zero. Both sides view the other as an existential threat. In that environment, any defensive posture or any attempt to seek a diplomatic compromise is automatically interpreted by the other side as either a trick to prepare for an attack or as a sign of weakness to be ruthlessly exploited.
So the instinct, driven by fear and mistrust, is to just strike first to show undeniable strength.
Exactly. But the intelligence assessments draw a very sharp line between naive pacifism and diplomatic realism. Diplomatic realism isn't about singing campfire songs hoping for the best and blindly trusting your enemy.
No, not at all.
It is about utilizing intense, high-leverage, non-military pressure. You maintain the crushing economic sanctions, you actively isolate them on the global diplomatic stage, you build a massive coalition of regional allies against them, and you use cyber tools to disrupt their networks.
You use every tool except the bombs?
Right. You leave the kinetic military option strictly as the absolute last resort. You do not use it as the default tool just because the hallway negotiations in Oman are getting frustrating and slow.
So if the Oman track was viable and the alternative was a regional war that would blow up U.S. bases and hijack the global supply chain, why did the architects of Operation Epic Fury pull the trigger? Why was violence chosen over the back channel?
The postmortems in our sources outline a deeply toxic cocktail of motivations. Ego is a massive factor. Political leaders want to look decisive, strong, and historically significant. Diplomacy is tedious, highly technical, glacially slow, and often looks unheroic to the voters back home.
Right, doesn't win elections.
Then you have domestic politics. Leaders are constantly playing to their political base, and sounding tough on Iran is a reliable applause line. There's also alliance signaling, specifically, the immense pressure to visibly reassure Israel and the Gulf states of an ironclad U.S. security commitment.
And if you take that a step further, there's institutional momentum.
Yes. The U.S. military is the most sophisticated, well-funded hammer in human history. And when you spend trillions of dollars building that hammer, there's an immense institutional bias that makes every geopolitical problem look like a nail.
Wow. Yeah.
The military tools, the stealth bombers, the cruise missiles, the targeting packages, they are always ready, primed, and deployable within hours. Diplomacy takes months of painstaking, frustrating work. And frankly, the sources highlight that there are actors, political action committees, and defense industries that actively profit financially and politically from heightened regional tension and continuous military replenishment.
So leaders made a conscious choice to bypass a working diplomatic channel. Driven by ego, political optics, and institutional bias, they chose military strikes.
Yep.
And the direct result of that choice was hundreds of destroyed structures on American bases,
Right.
soldiers killed, a severely degraded deterrence posture, and a hijacked global economy bleeding the middle class dry through inflation.
And because they chose this preventable disaster and the receipts are catastrophic, the leaders now have a massive PR problem on their hands. How do you justify this reality to your voters?
Which brings us right back to the false binary, the narrative warfare. Because they can't admit the reality of the failure, they must construct a cage of narratives to force the public to pick a team. We have to deconstruct these frames.
Let's do it.
Let's look at the U.S. and Trump framing right now. What is the specific story they are broadcasting to the world?
The primary U.S. narrative is a carefully curated story of decisive, righteous success. The talking points you hear every day are, our military objectives were entirely achieved. The enemy's capacity is crippled. The kinetic war is essentially over.
They completely omit the damage to their own bases.
Entirely. Furthermore, they brand all Iranian actions in the Strait, the PGSA, the fast boat harassment, purely as unprovoked piracy and state-sponsored terrorism. In contrast, they brand all U.S. actions, including the aggressive naval blockade and Project Freedom escorts, as the noble defensive protection of international commerce, freedom of navigation, and allied security.
It's framed as the world's policeman stopping a mugging. Now, let's flip the channel and look at the Iranian framing.
Yeah.
What is the supreme leader in Tehran broadcasting to their domestic audience and the global south?
It's the exact mirror image. Their narrative is an epic story of heroic sovereign resistors to unhinged imperialist aggression. They frame their control and taxation over the Strait of Hormuz not as extortion, but as the legitimate legal exercise of sovereign rights over their adjacent territorial waters.
Right.
They brand the crushing U.S. blockade and the naval escorts as modern-day piracy, blatant imperialism, and a direct violation of the so-called ceasefire. They present the PGSA as a responsible, modern administrative body stepping up to manage a vital waterway that the Americans destabilized.
It is absolutely stunning how perfectly symmetrical the propaganda is. Both sides claim total victory. Both sides claim they are the victim of piracy. And both sides claim they're the only ones acting legally. And what makes this so infuriating is the media's complicity in laundering these narratives.
Oh, the media plays a huge role.
They use comfortable, anesthetizing words. They repeat the term ceasefire on the evening news instead of describing it as what it really is. A fragile, terrifying pause in explosions while brutal economic warfare rages on. They report success instead of detailing the partial degradation of enemy capabilities at the cost of immense strategic vulnerability.
They lazily adopt words like defensive escorts or sovereign administration as moral cover for what is at its core the coercive, violent control of the global commons. This narrative cage is incredibly effective because it preys on fundamental human psychology. We are wired to want a clear villain and a flawless hero. We want a simple story with good guys and bad guys. When the media and the politicians offer us these pre-packaged, emotionally satisfying binaries, it is so much easier to pick a side, put on the jersey, and argue about morality than it is to look at the ugly, complex, math-driven reality of power politics.
It's like two arsonists standing in front of a burning apartment building.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah, one arsonist is arguing passionately to the crowd that he lit the fire to clear out a termite infestation and save the foundation of the building. The other arsonist is arguing he lit the fire in the lobby to keep the freezing neighborhood warm.
Right.
And instead of the police arresting them both, the media has the entire neighborhood standing around the burning building, violently arguing with each other over which arsonist has the moral high ground. And no one is stopping to ask the obvious question, why the hell is our house on fire?
That is the perfect distillation of the diversion. The tribal division isn't an accident, it is the entire point. If we are busy arguing about who is legally right or who has the moral high ground, we are absolutely not demanding accountability for the economic fallout.
We're totally distracted.
We are not asking the hard questions about why the diplomatic track in Oman was abandoned. We are successfully distracted by the fireworks.
So we've detonated the truth bomb. We've stripped away the spin. We see the raw mechanics of leverage. We see the cost in the supply chain. Where does this actually lead? Now that we see through the magician's trick, what are the realistic outcomes for the world and for you, the listener, moving forward into the summer of 2026?
The intelligence models lay out 3 potential paths. Let's walk through the mechanics of each one.
Okay, let's do it.
The first path, which the intelligence community identifies as the most probable near-term outcome, is categorized as managed tension.
Managed tension. That sounds like a corporate buzzword for a nightmare. What does that physically look like on the ground?
It looks like the new miserable normal. It means a continuous stream of periodic, low-level military incidents that stay just below the threshold of all-out war. The U.S. maintains its naval blockade, strangling Iran's economy, but unable to stop all the smuggling.
Iran.
Iran incrementally tests the limits with the PGSA, occasionally harassing a tanker or delaying shipments just to prove they still hold the cards. Oil prices remain highly elevated and wildly volatile, spiking every time a fast boat gets too close to a destroyer.
Oh, man.
And the diplomatic talks in Oman resume, but they drag on endlessly, punctuated by artificial deadlines and hollow threats of new strikes. The ceasefire simply becomes the baseline state of a permanent, low-grade global economic crisis.
I have to say, the bleakness of Path 1 is overwhelming. If managed tension is the most likely outcome, that just means the rest of the planet essentially accepts a permanent, multi-billion-dollar extortion racket as background noise.
Sadly, yes.
It means we just accept that inflation will permanently be a point or two higher, gas will always be more expensive, and our supply chains will remain structurally fragile forever simply because two sides cannot get over their political egos.
Unfortunately, history shows us that geopolitical stalemates can last for decades if neither side possesses the overwhelming power to achieve total victory, and neither side possesses the political courage to make the painful concessions required for peace. You end up in a grinding war of attrition.
Okay, what is path two?
Path 2 is escalation. This is the nightmare scenario. Under the constant grinding strain of managed tension, someone inevitably miscalculates.
Like an accident.
Yeah, a junior naval officer on a U.S. destroyer gets trigger-happy and sinks an Iranian patrol boat. Or an Iranian proxy group in Iraq pushes too far and launches a rocket that kills a dozen American contractors. Or a drone strikes the wrong target in Saudi Arabia.
And then it all falls apart.
The fragile pause immediately shatters. Limited strikes resume, but because deterrence is already broken, the retaliation spiral moves faster. We see a catastrophic closure of the strait, a massive global oil shock that crashes the stock market, a wider regional war dragging in neighboring Gulf countries, and massive military and civilian casualties on all sides.
It is the ultimate catastrophic failure of the security dilemma. Both sides acting defensively until everything burns.
Exactly.
Which brings us to path 3. The geopolitical analysts call this the least bad realistic outcome.
Right, because we have to be very clear. A quote-unquote good outcome, where everyone goes home happy and the region is peaceful, does not exist anymore. Path 3 is a transactional deal.
How does that work?
Mechanically, this looks very much like the Omen track that was recklessly abandoned in February. It involves phased, highly conditional sanctions relief for Iran, slowly unlocking their frozen funds, in exchange for strict, verifiable, intrusive IAEA steps to curtail their nuclear and missile programs.
So back to the hotel hallways.
Exactly. And crucially, it also requires an internationally acceptable face-saving arrangement for managing transit through the Strait of Hormuz. Something that isn't purely unilateral Iranian extortion via the PGSA, but also isn't permanent U.S. gunboat enforcement.
Like a middle ground.
Perhaps a joint maritime coalition involving regional states like Oman and Qatar.
So nobody gets what they want.
Nobody gets their maximalist demands. Neither side gets to plant a flag and declare total victory. But both sides get enough breathing room to spin the deal to their domestic audiences. The core underlying issues, the deep ideological hatred, the regional proxy wars in Yemen and Syria, the human rights abuses, they are not solved at all.
Right.
They are simply punting them down the road or managed within acceptable, non-apocalyptic parameters.
And our sources outline the real systemic solutions needed to actually achieve path 3.
Yeah.
Verifiable military stand-downs, a coordinated neutral management of the strait, serious regional security dialogues involving the Gulf states who are terrified of being caught in the crossfire.
Yeah, they're terrified.
And a massive long-term global infrastructure push to diversify energy supply chains away from this single geographic choke point. Every Gulf state, the European Union, the Asian manufacturing giants, everyone is praying for path 3.
But the political egos and the domestic politics might trap us in path 1 for years.
Because path 3 requires compromise. And compromise is politically dangerous, sometimes politically fatal, for leaders who have built their entire domestic brand on projecting absolute, uncompromising strength.
Exactly.
So to synthesize this entire deep dive, the U.S.-Iran Hormuz crisis of May 2026 is not a simple, clean morality play. It is not a story of good versus evil, and it is certainly not a story of a decisive, flawless military triumph.
No.
It is a chosen, entirely preventable conflict driven by ego, institutional momentum, and domestic politics. It resulted in a brutal, bloody geopolitical stalemate where a battered middle power successfully used the geography of a 21-mile-wide strait to counter the conventional military might of a global superpower.
And in doing so, they created a highly effective blueprint for asymmetric economic warfare that the entire world is now forced to navigate.
I want to speak directly to you, the listener, for a moment. As you digest all of the mechanics we've walked through today, remember that you are not just a passive spectator watching a geopolitical chess match on the evening news. You are the one physically paying the bill for this brinkmanship.
Yeah, every single day.
Every time you fill up your car with gas, every time you buy groceries that were delivered on a diesel truck, every time you pay for a flight or order a package online, you are paying the energy tax levied by this conflict.
That's right.
The narrative managers in Washington and Tehran want you scared, they want you tribal, and they desperately want you distracted by the fireworks of the right hand. Look past them. See the raw mechanics of leverage. See the costs.
That is the only way to demand real accountability from our leaders. If we understand the mechanics of the game, we stop falling for the misdirection, we stop arguing over the arsonists, and start demanding they put out the fire.
We started this deep dive talking about a magic trick. The illusion entirely relies on your attention being focused exactly where the magician wants it, on the designated spectacle, the sparks and the smoke. But once you know how the trick actually works, once you see the left hand moving quietly toward your pocket, the magic disappears.
It ceases to be an illusion.
It's just a hustle. And as we leave you today, I want to leave you with one final lingering thought. We've just spent the last hour breaking down the exact mechanics of how effectively a middle power can use a single geographic choke point to hold the entire global economy hostage, effectively forcing the world's greatest superpower to a geopolitical standstill.
A total standstill.
The blueprint has been successfully drawn, tested, and proven in the waters of Hormuz. As global supply chains remain incredibly fragile and stretched tightly across the globe, you have to wonder, looking at the map of the world today, whether it's the Strait of Malacca, the Bab el-Mandeb, or the South China Sea, which global choke point will be the next to be held for ransom? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives you are fed, keep your eyes on the left hand, and we will see you next time.